Some of the most fascinating claims and myths in Final Fantasy XIV come about as a result of something that, whether it is true or not, doesn't really matter, or is minimally impactful if it is, and especially so if it is inconvenient to test. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be interesting to investigate just the same. I want to go over a handful of these kinds of claims and myths and explain how or why they are false, if they even are false. And if you know of some strange myths or claims that might be so incredibly specific they rarely ever come up as significant, do be sure to share them in the comments. Now, let's get myth-busting. Number 1. Machinists should always use their battery as often as possible, and always use them at max battery. Now, this one might seem a bit strange given the introductory context. Let me explain. Before patch 6.2, the exact duration of the Automaton Queen varied depending on how much battery gauge you spent. This was changed to a fixed 12 seconds in 6.2. Before this change, the exact amount of battery you spent could dictate how many arm punches you got and how much damage the finishers did. Now, the quantity of attacks you get is mostly fixed, and the battery gauge linearly scales the damage, meaning 50 gauge will add up to X damage, and 100 gauge will add up to X times 2 exactly. The exception to this is that if the Queen's target moves too much, it may be possible to convince her to use Roller Dash an extra time instead of an arm punch, which would be worth 2 arm punches. In a vacuum, whether you send the Queen off-rip every time you have enough battery to summon her at all, or wait until you're as close to full as possible, wouldn't matter. The only thing that really matters is that she scales real time with raid buffs on you, so a full gauge Queen during raid buffs is a lot more effective than only half gauge, or even worse, no Queen during buffs, just so you can do a full battery Queen after buffs. In terms of optimization, what matters is that 1, all battery is well spent, and 2, that if you have the choice, you fit as much battery gauge spending inside raid buffs as possible. Now, the original claims tend to originate from either an assumption or the fact that the Queen scaled weirdly with gauge before 6.2, or from the fact that the Rook auto turret does not scale the same, and the player simply assumed this continued to apply for the Queen. And this is where the claim relates to the introductory context. The Rook auto turret will fire 5 volley fires at the target, and then Rook overload. The overload itself has a potency of 160 that linearly scales to 320, i.e. times 2, as battery gauge spending increases up to 100. The volley fires, on the other hand, start at 35 potency, but finish at 75, not 70. This means that one way you can look at it is that these volleys do 7 potency per 10 battery for the first 50 battery, but 8 potency per 10 battery for the second 50 battery. However, this sounds like a much bigger deal than it really is. The full potency of a 50 battery turret is 335 potency, with 160 from the overload and 175 from the volley fires. 2 of these would add up to 670. Meanwhile, a single 100 battery gauge turret would be 320 potency overload and 575 potency volley fires for 375 potency, adding up to 695 potency combined. Notice that the difference is 25 potency. The difference is so small that overcapping battery gauge just to be sure you get a full battery gauge turret would lose you over twice as much potency as you would gain. In other words, the potential gain is so small it is hardly worth the hassle. Ultimately, just like with the Queen, it is a bit more important to make good use of all your gauge than using them in full batches of 100 or using it exactly on cooldown. Number 2. You must hit the boss to secure your checkpoint. This one is a classic, and I believe the main reason why it perpetuates so well, whether it has evidence or not, is because for years it was not something you could easily test on your own, and in the cases where you got to the checkpoint, most teams wouldn't bother testing this, for good reason. Besides, it doesn't cost you anything to slap the boss before jumping off the arena to reset, so might as well, right? Now, that said, wouldn't it be nice to know the answer anyway? The first Savage boss fight to have a checkpoint was Exdeath, O4S, and with how far we are into Dawntrail, it is actually quite trivial, I would say, to reach Phase 2, so he will be our test subject. Now, whatever happens, I think it is worth mentioning with boss fight tests like this that it is perfectly possible that some bosses are designed one way and others another, which is to say, regardless of what this test demonstrates, it is possible it isn't consistent between all the bosses. Now, once we reached Phase 2, I waited until the first mechanic of Neo Exdeath went through to be absolutely perfectly certain that I didn't miss the checkpoint by jumping too early. And despite not hitting the boss at all, the checkpoint still worked. Now, whether this applies universally or not, I still advise that you continue hitting the boss before resetting to quote-unquote secure the checkpoint. As naturally, there's a very simple explanation as to why a myth like this would come about. If it becomes generally accepted that you don't have to hit the boss, we all know that one day there will be that guy who's just a tad too quick on the trigger, that just yeets themselves the instant the cutscene for the phase change begins, and indeed the checkpoint wasn't granted yet, and ding dong back to phase 1. By demanding that you hit the boss before you wipe up, at the very least, you ensure that the boss has fully spawned and is real and attackable before you jump, which is definitely safely past the checkpoint snapshot, assuming there is a checkpoint. So, in conclusion, no, you don't actually have to attack the boss. At least, this holds true for O4S, the origin of this feature. However, you should still do it. It is just a good safety measure to make sure you don't jump too soon. Number 3. Bloodwhetting's healing is unaffected by healing increasing effects. False. Now, back in Endwalker, in this same Mythbuster series, I demonstrated that Bloodwhetting's healing was completely unaffected by all healing increasing effects, among them Thrill of Battle. Because of the weird way the ability works, applies an effect to you that heals when you land weapon skills, it still calls into question how it would interact with healing increasing effects. In patch 7.1, the Resolved Issues section of the patch notes stated that a bug was fixed which caused Thrill of Battle, in particular, to not affect Bloodwhetting or Nascent Flash. Before this fix, no healing increasing effects affected them. So this bug fix of course calls into question whether other interactions also were fixed. Not to mention how Bloodwhetting interacts with healing increasing effects. Now, first, Bloodwhetting's healing scales in real time with healing increasing effects, which means that any heals applied by Bloodwhetting while Thrill of Battle is active will be boosted by it, while any heals after Thrill of Battle ends will not. Nascent Flash works the same way, and as the healing of Nascent Glint is a straight copy of the healing of Nascent Flash on the warrior itself, using Thrill of Battle will increase the healing received by both players. To demonstrate its interaction with other healing effects, we first test Nature's Min from Bard, which is a raid-wide increase, and observe the exact same result as with Thrill of Battle, although the effect itself is a bit smaller as expected, 15% versus 20%. Next, we test with Astrologian's The Arrow card. Note that The Arrow increases healing received, not done. A surprisingly common misconception. Again, the same result. So, in conclusion, Bloodwhetting and Nascent Flash scales with healing increasing effects in real time. In most cases, the healing from these actions are already plenty without this extra help, although sometimes Thrill of Battle boosting Nascent Flash could be handy for saving someone else, I guess. Number 4. Considering the amount of guaranteed critical hits Warrior has, would it actually be more beneficial to stack Determination in a vacuum? So, this hypothetical originates from the fact that warriors do an astounding amount of guaranteed critical direct hits. A rough estimate is that somewhere around 42% of a warrior's potencies are guaranteed critical direct hits. Note, not to be confused with 42% of a warrior's GCDs. I am talking about the raw potencies. If we're talking in a vacuum, then there is no "but what if there's chain stratagem from a scholar" or similar. On that note, the damage of a guaranteed critical hit, if we just ignore the direct hit portion for a moment, would start at 40% more damage, and every 13.9 points of critical hit, the stat, not including the base amount, would increase this by 0.1%. Meanwhile, Determination starts at 0% and increases the damage by 0.1% for every about 19.8571 points. Normally, the reason why critical hit has this compounding effect where the more you have, the better it gets, is because the chance and power is increased simultaneously. However, if the crit chance is maxed out from the get-go, then this effect no longer applies. And just for the record, the chance granted by a critical hit stat is not used at all for the guaranteed critical hits. However, chance boosting buffs like Chain Stratagem combine for one more damage multiplier. In other words, this means that as far as the warrior's auto crits are concerned, you have a 40% damage bonus that you can increase by 0.1% for 13.9 points of crit, and a 0% damage bonus that you can increase by 0.1% for every 19.8571 points. And these two bonuses multiply together. Noting that even with 0 direct hit, the guaranteed direct crits will be, well, direct crits. Point for point, Determination in a vacuum will indeed increase the damage of the guaranteed direct crits more than critical hit would. However, the difference is so small that this would mainly matter if, for whatever reason, your gear set has a surprisingly low amount of critical hit in the first place, as once you reach higher amounts of critical hit, the combined value of critical hit for both your direct crits and the normal attacks will overtake Determination easily. Easily! To try and put it into perspective, adding together the normal potencies and direct crit potencies a warrior would approximately expect to get over a 3-minute period, it almost kinda loops, sort of, but not really, gives us about 23,040 normal potency and 16,440 direct crit potency. Then, multiplying the normal attacks by the average amount of crit, direct hit, and determination from the current rate tier's best in slot list, and applying the damage bonuses to the direct crits as well, we get 31,030 average normal potency and 38,439 direct crit potency, which combines for a total of 69,000 nice, 469 double nice potencies worth of damage. 69,469. If we hypothetically moved 100 critical hit over to determination, the average normal potency would decrease by 25, while the direct crit potency would increase by like 4, meaning that indeed the direct crit portion would increase, but by a much smaller fraction, leading to a lower grand total. In other words, as was probably expected at the get-go, the difference is minuscule. However, critical hit, of course, wins over determination once you reach over a certain point. Also, for maybe a bit of clarification, the way guaranteed critical hits and direct hits interact with critical hit rate bonuses from buffs, and both direct hit the stat and direct hit bonuses from buffs, is that for the crit damage portion, a new multiplier is produced consisting of 1 plus your crit damage times the chance bonus from buffs. For direct hit, a similar multiplier is produced, combining your actual direct hit chance with bonuses from buffs and multiplying it instead by 0.25, the direct hit bonus. These multipliers are simply multiplied onto the regular multipliers, meaning a direct crit would have the regular crit damage bonus times the new crit damage bonus from buffs times 1.25 from direct hit and times the new direct hit damage bonus. This would indeed also mean that while critical hit already wins in the example, once raid buffs that increase crit chance are introduced, having more crit damage from stats would help the guaranteed direct crits almost certainly more than determination would. But still, the difference is actually surprisingly small. And finally, number 5. Scholars favor critical hit for the Adloquium crits. While indeed critical hit the stat would lead to bigger Adloquium crits, and more of them in cases where you are not just casting Adloquium with recitation, it should come as no surprise that Scholar tends to prioritize critical hit for the same reason most other jobs do. Most effective at increasing damage output. The fact it equally really helps on healing output is an added side bonus. This is also the same reason why most best-in-slot sets for Scholar will make use of direct hit, which contributes nothing to your Adlo crits. Now, with that said, perhaps a funny little detail about Adloquium crits with recitation is that if you actually want the biggest possible Adloquium shield crits, similar to the warrior case from before, as recitation guarantees the crit, critical hit, the stat, becomes simply a multiplier that starts higher and scales a bit faster than determination. Broadly speaking, whether you stack crit or determination actually leads to nearly the same power Adloquium crit. But if you want the biggest possible Adloquium crit shields, the best you can do is try to evenly split the two, as whichever one is more impactful almost comes down to whichever one has incremented least recently. Ain't that something? Of course, Scholar also has other builds to work with a notably relatively high spell speed one, even for healers. So when it comes to extremely convoluted optimization that doesn't make that much of a difference, stat builds are almost always the king. Remember, if you have met some odd claim or myth that seems so insignificant that while it might be true, whether it is or not is so unimpactful that it is incredibly likely no one ever bothered to check, do be sure to let me know about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before it was changed to a fixed 12 seconds in Endwalker, the Automaton Queen's duration varied based on battery gauge input, with the finishers scaling with the input as they do now. This meant a full battery queen would last 20 seconds, which by today's standard doesn't necessarily sound too bad, but at the time of the change, raid buffs lasted 15 seconds.